laws, but also Humacao, a large-scale solar plant, which lost a large percentage of its panels, but noticing that small generators, including the small hydro plant in Rio Blanco, stayed up throughout the storm. And so the charge for the students was to think about how do we move away from kind of monofunctional energy systems while designing for long-term recovery. How do you instead design for kind of multiple critical functions while supporting community use and community identity? So our studio asked students to imagine what it would mean to think of the long-term recovery as fundamentally tied to an idea of community power, which we define as resilient community-based power supporting delivery of critical services, building local autonomy, and addressing long-standing systemic inequalities. So we were kind of purposefully conflating the idea of power in its electrical and its political dimensions. And then for the studio, we focused in on 3 sites, each of which we had a relationship with a local organization that could act as a liaison. And then for each site, students asked what community power meant for these communities impacted, and I'll give an example from 2 of these sites. So in Naguabo, all the way on the east, which was directly kind of in the path of Maria, several students looked at the breakdown in road access and kind of looking at postal routes and when mail service got restored as a proxy, and started thinking that we need to rethink the kind of major organization of road communication to think about resilient roads. They were making a play on Roosevelt Roads, which is nearby. But in any case, how do we tie back into the coast to upland communities instead of along the coast where roads are in danger of washouts and coastal flooding? So in this project, Sarah asked how can these resilient roads also be paired with kind of a hyper-localized energy production up in the foothills based on her observation of successful microhydro working in Rio Blanco. And then thinking back to the energy failures during Maria, much of which had to do with these transmission breakdowns, often exacerbated by kind of under-resourced right-of-way management. With resilient roads, this is a way of thinking about evacuation routes on the one hand, but also potentially resilient electrical transmission corridors, ecotourism routes, an idea of kind of a bundled linear infrastructure corridor that could act holistically and together. So zooming in on Naguabo, some of the students played this out, identifying the possibility of resilient trails that could connect coast to upland. In this way, provide tourism connectivity during typical conditions, but also able to support evacuation and goods delivery during emergency events. So here we have Naguabo. Here's the proposed new trail system along the river, and here are the proposed community hubs paired with the trail system, either through construction of new community centers or by activating existing public buildings and social facilities, which might be kind of under-resourced or underutilized. But with the idea that these centers support social infrastructure during daily use and then emergency function during emergency events. Or we can play this out in Naguabo's satellite coastal town, Tropical Beach, for whom a local resilience hub might actually be better positioned in Jucárez, which is just over a mile away and has significantly more upland territory and better connections to resilient roads that lead to safety. So today there's this kind of underutilized parcel near the coast. The idea is to place the resilience hub here with its own energy production and connect it with daily services like bus shuttle terminal, New Market, both of which could face onto a central plaza, which currently this settlement doesn't have. Connect this to a resilient road, evacuation route. There's also the idea of a coastal ferry service. So this community hub is then connected to a proposed new public pier, which would have shops and ferry station. So the idea is that during the storm, the community hub is able to transition to a new role, providing critical services like communication, refrigeration, water filtration, and have it be able to stand up its own power supply and, of course, Wi-Fi. A robust pier for landing supplies, and so you think of this as designing for emergency recovery to happen right in the middle of town instead of like in the big stadium out on the edge. So the idea was to embed this kind of thinking with the town's government now while they're making rebuilding decisions and zoning decisions, because after the window closes, they'll have the system that they have, that they've built, and that's what they're going to be responding to the next stormwind. So, okay, switching sites to San Juan, a couple of students played out what a resilient multi-purpose community infrastructure could look like in the context of the San Jose Lagoon, which is bordered by some of the most vulnerable communities in San Juan, such as the informal community of Playita, kind of down here, just across the highway from housing project Llorens Torres, which has its own vulnerabilities, right? So students looked at the whole lagoon as a system, and together developed a larger framework plan for the lagoon and adjacent communities for flood protection and community power. I'll show you just one of these facilities, but I think you'll get the idea. So in his design for a multifunctional community center, which is adjacent to an existing wastewater pump station and electrical substation and kind of vacant parcel, Way is taking advantage of existing publicly owned land, thinking of the facility as both infrastructure and public space. So in his proposal, there's a learning center, community gym, and library next to Central Plaza and local market, which are called out along the right side. And at the same time, there's proposed integration of infrastructure processes like recycling and local power generation from anaerobic digestion and solar, along with emergency supply storage, water filtration, water storage tanks, ice production, ice storage, cooling center, all of which are visible to the community. So this combo of social infrastructure for daily use and emergency services is fairly typical of how Way designed each of his 4 nodes, which I won't show. And many students in the studio gravitated to this idea of social infrastructure, right? This idea articulated very well by Eric Kleinenberg of social infrastructure. Kleinenberg traced the power of supporting spaces like libraries and civic institutions as having the ability to strengthen social networks and make populations less vulnerable to stresses by having these links across generations and between neighbors. So typically, infrastructure and public space are thought of as 2 separate things, and infrastructure is invisible to most people until it breaks down, right? As kind of the whole panel, as Gabe set up for us. So in this case, Way is thinking of them as integrated parts and as components that add up to build local community self-sufficiency and local community power. Here, Way articulated it a little bit better than some others in the studio, but across the studio, when we imagine what strong nodes in the energy network would look like, many students argue that they should be reinforced through public space, through housing, through higher density, and then of course also have all the emergency response components, shelter, staging, evacuation, all the critical needs of reliable food and water supply, medicine storage, cooling, etc. So finally, the studio waded into ideas of how the idea of community land trusts and cooperatives could be extended to infrastructure. And here, Way diagrams how conventionally outside investment is relied on to support the economy, while infrastructure is paid for by the government. But as we've seen in poor communities like Playita, this often results in poor maintenance, especially for the most vulnerable and disempowered, the least politically connected. So with his proposed new structure, there's an idea that both government and emergency funding, along with external investment, goes to support and stand up community infrastructure cooperatives, which procure the kinds of infrastructure that they think they will be able to maintain, and which the cooperatives subsequently own, and which in turn support economic development through tourism, local small business, in a space where locals and tourists can mix, and which has a kind of public-facing urban design expression. Okay, so lastly, in the minute I have remaining, in terms of this idea of embracing uncertainty, here's just a quick example that is less focused on energy infrastructure in particular, but which demonstrates a mode of working that allows us to work using kind of speculative, future narrative construction. It's usually more the realm of literature, science fiction, or climate fiction, along with scenario-based design to imagine how slow change might unfold and how we might prepare. So in this project, one student looked at sea level rise projections for the larger San Juan geography and saw that over time, San Juan really becomes an archipelago. Some of the most vulnerable settlements, like Playita and Caño Martin Peña, are permanently flooded. But in this scenario, Shannon proposes that we start a process of investing in the spines of high ground that will remain and start supporting these spines to become more central to daily life. So the community given, in some ways, the key to its own transformation. The spines of high ground are identified, families can start to get relocated upland, and then a process of jointly unbuilding the edge by replanting mangroves and growing a network of community facilities like these, again paired with both daily and emergency function, that can start to function as stewards of this new public landscape so that the community is kind of in control of its own unbuilding as it reinforces the high ground and the kind of culture that can be developed in these neighborhoods of safety. Thanks.
Next up, we have Daniel Soto, who's an associate professor of geography, environment, and planning at Sonoma State University.
All right, thank you, folks. So I'm going to talk about links between sort of disasters, energy, and opportunities from a slightly different perspective. Sonoma State University is in Northern California. And we are basically located in the fire zone of Northern California. So let's see, what am I, how about that? Okay, so first of all, I want to weigh into the debate from yesterday, to grid or not to grid, that is the question. I want to borrow a quote from Amory Lovins. For all its power and vitality, only a tool. Good servant, bad master, worse religion. All right, so that's my contribution to yesterday's debate. Here is a photo from this fall, from about a week or so ago, that kind of illustrates sort of what we're dealing with. We are famous for being a beautiful, idyllic place. This couple came in from another part of the United States to have their wedding. They were there as the Kincaid Fire was breaking out, and so they were dealing with smoke inhalation risks and stuff on their wedding day. Somebody took this photo, forwarded it around, and it instantly became iconic in Sonoma County. So, but again, it sort of illustrates how do we go about our lives having these kinds of precious moments and other moments with these dangers in the backdrop. I think it's kind of an interesting illustration. All right, so a little bit of a chronology. These disasters are sort of important to me, and I have a lot of personal experience. So in Hurricane Rita in Texas, my uncle's roof was torn off from his home by a wind event, and the wind and water damaged my aunt's home. Hurricane Ike destroyed my grandparents' home. The last time I visited my grandparents' home, it was a slab, and I cried. Hurricane Sandy in 2012, I was in New York. We spent 11 days without power. Some places went without power for 29 days. And it was both warm and cold weather that we had to survive through. It was interesting. And we were taking care of some elderly folks. The Valley Fire in 2015 was in an area called Lake County north of us. It was sort of our first wake-up call. A handful of students were affected. The school was not affected. But in retrospect, it kind of foreshadowed what was going to happen. Hurricane Harvey in 2016, my aunt had to be rescued from her home, which was already damaged by Rita, in a canoe. And then the Tubbs Fire in 2017, this is the one that kind of shocked our area and went into the national consciousness. We had students evacuated in the middle of the night, unable to gas up their cars, in enormous traffic jams on Highway 101, basically, just experiencing the full sort of panic and terror of an event like this. Our president of our university nearly lost her life and lost her home and everything. So that one really sort of woke us up. The Paradise Fire, we have at least one person I see from the Chico community. The Paradise Fire did not affect us directly as sort of an ignition risk, but we ended up losing a day of class because of the smoke, air quality, and inhalation risks from that fire, even though it was hundreds of miles away. And then the Kincaid Fire last year, this year, we had a bunch of public safety power shutdowns in anticipation of the high wind events that have driven these last couple of wildfires, and which are all connected to the electricity system. So we lost days because of that, and then the fire actually broke out, and we were never under an ignition risk, but we were, our power was threatened. We didn't have the backup supplies to make it the whole week, and the surrounding infrastructure was gone, so we had to, or not gone, but unpowered, so we had to make a decision. So based on all that, what are my sort of observations about the kinds of brittle pieces and the opportunities for the future? So for us here in Northern California, there's kind of three kind of categories, right? There's the basic ignition risk, right? There's the risk of flames and heat. But there's also these smoke inhalation risks, which can drift, right? The entire San Francisco Bay Area during the Tubbs fire had air quality problems and some schools shut down in one of the most popular, prosperous, and powerful areas of California and the nation of the world. And then the other thing that's really emerging is that PG&E, since the vast majority of these have been sort of trees becoming grounding lines for the power lines and the fires happening, the choice they've been making is to shut down the power. And so that also has its attendant risks for people on medical services, traffic safety, all sorts of things like that. So what were some of the cascading things I observed? So first of all, fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are great, right? Dirt cheap to store them. But let me tell you about the great things about fossil fuels. Dirt cheap to store them, ubiquitous. Electricity is much harder to store. It costs hundreds of dollars in order to store 10 cents of electricity. It's like drinking from a golden diamond-encrusted chalice, right? So gas stations could not pump gasoline without the electricity. There was gas in the ground at the gas stations. People couldn't drive around as much. So that kind of locked everything up until we could get pumps into the gas stations. So HVA systems, those have pilot lights that could be actual flames, or they could be electrical ignition systems. A lot of the East Coast has hot water circulation for baseboard heating. None of those pumps worked. So the fossil fuels have this reputation for ease of storage and ease of use, but they're actually brittle because they're connected to these other things. And for those of you that might not know, in San Bruno we had a natural gas explosion. So we realized that fossil fuels increase fuel loads in fires. So people who were in these areas were reporting the sort of rural backup propane tanks exploding. So those create an additional fuel load and safety risk for people in those areas. Now, one of the things we've learned a lot about is that these communication systems have multiple dependencies. All right, I've been told I got 5 on it. All right, so research, the energy is redundantly supplied. I've talked to the folks at Verizon, it's amazing. They have battery backup systems that cause completely seamless, blinkless transition from the grid to a battery-powered inverter that can then stage them until you get to the generator power. However, digital transmission floats on gossamer tendrils of fiber optic cable across the landscape, and the minute those go, if you don't have what's called a microwave backhaul where the information goes over the wavelengths, you've completely lost anything. So all of your energy robustness is gone because you lost this fiber optic cable. And these communication failures impeded evacuation efforts. I don't know if anybody's tried to do any attribution science about what sorts of fatalities were exacerbated by these communication efforts, but technology is only one, the energy is only one piece, but there's also sort of social pieces. So what strengths have we sort of seen on the basis of this? So Sonoma County, we saw a lot of sort of local resilience occur. We saw communities come together. We saw all of the things that we see in other disaster areas. And so we saw the strength of the social networks. And so an interesting question is sort of, we see that many of our technological networks are brittle. What causes robustness or brittleness in social networks? In Hurricane Sandy, the municipal grid was back up in a couple days. Our area, just a couple of miles away, took 11 days. So my job was to go to the Rockville Center on my bicycle. They had warming, they had power, they had an information session. I was literally doing phone interviews for academic jobs during our blackout. This community center was a huge source of resources and strength in the community. I'm not sure whether the municipal grid was causal or not, but a lot of people were really interested in what that sort of local control allowed them to do. So now what are we seeing as a result, good and bad? So lots of interest in personal diesel generation or petrol generation or whatever that is. From Sandy, we had asphyxiation risks from these generators. We had fire risks from the fuel. You're increasing the fuel load in vulnerable areas. So not clear if this is a scalable strategy. We've installed fire camera surveillance networks in order to try to identify things more quickly and get the word out more quickly. So the good news in Kincaid was we didn't have any loss of life from citizens in that fire. I don't know if we got lucky because of the particular fire dynamics or if our communication systems have improved since 2017. Many folks are talking about microgrids. We're trying to really try to understand what exactly are the benefits and abilities. What do they do for ignition risks? What do they do for power backup? How can we be intentional about pursuing those? Retirement communities as critical care facilities are very interested in backup power. We have students working with retirement communities who are trying to figure out what they want to do for the feasibility of microgrids. And Santa Rosa Junior College has an enormous grant to put in a microgrid, and we're trying to actually see what the techno-economics of backup power, reliability, and all those things. How can the microgrid actually be compensated for the services? Municipals have come, so PG&E is public enemy number one in Northern California. One of the things that we're thinking about is what are the costs and benefits of municipal control of these, right? So what does municipal control do to the behavior of that grid, the quality of that grid, the safety of that grid? And we've been doing community choice aggregation for a while. This is a policy mechanism that allows us to decide where we buy our power from. So we have two products. There's a sort of about half the carbon intensity of the PG&E grid product called, doesn't matter, and then Clean Start is the 100%. It's like 10 times less carbon intensity than the main grid. And that sort of policy mechanism is spread to other communities. So let me just end up with this idea of uncertainty and our limited vocabulary for dealing with it, right? So we have to place bets on safety and planning decisions, immediate and long-term, based on incomplete information. However, think about the last time a 50-50 weather forecast upset you. The forecast was correct. The chances were 50-50. If you sum all the 50-50 weather forecasts, it rains on half the days and it doesn't rain on half the days, right? So how do we develop a language of uncertainty based on this? And it's both for our disaster planning, but also if we want to move to a renewable energy system, because suddenly everything about the energy system and the loads become probabilistic. All right, so thank you very much for your attention.
We have about 20 minutes for Q&A, so maybe panelists can join the front table up here, and I'll moderate any questions from the audience. Yeah, start here.
We've been seeing a lot of discussions and talk about the resources, the actual, our facilities all the way down for power generation. And as it starts to get more distributed or disaggregated, and I love this idea of moving down to the community level, what's being done to the software and the control, or what should be done for all the software control of all of this, power as it's being distributed from one point to another, as your resources get more local, and you don't want the decision-making process still being centralized. You want to distribute that too. So what is being done and what should be done to all the decision-making process software algorithms that control power generation distribution?
Could you also introduce yourself?
Oh, my name is Albert Vega, with a small company called Building Momentum out of Alexandria, Virginia. And our spare time, we go to disaster areas to help out.
Well, I can try to answer that question. It's very difficult because we are used to control and operate a classical power system, and basically it operates itself until something major happens, and then the operators have to control the power system. So we have to like mimic the same scenario with microgrids that now will be operating with big grids, and between them. So it gets complicated because there's a lot of variables involved. We study one thing that is called the power flows, and the power flows are more variables than equations to solve. And if you multiply that by 5, 10, 20, 100 times, but you have a lot of variables that you don't know, and you have to somehow develop that kind of control. So the development of microgrids, in my opinion, has to do more in the control area than even in the power systems area. And I didn't have the time to show you, but we have a microgrid lab in the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, in which we are actually trying to answer those questions. And we have funding from NSF and other sources to do that, DOE, etc. We are even integrating this last year the topic of this microgrid protection, which is it's very fuzzy already, and we're trying to develop these solutions. So maybe Marcel can add to this question, but that's part of what we are trying to develop.
So going from the microgrid laboratory, we have a colleague, Fabio Andrade, which I think is the person that knows the most about microgrids in Puerto Rico, and we collaborate with him all the time, and there is something called hierarchical control, and so it's a line of study, and it looks into that, right? So how you can control microgrids, different size, and integrate to the grid. But I think before going to that software and control, which is very important, we need to think, where do we want to put the resources of generation and storage? Because depending on where you want to put those, the controls will look different. For example, what I mentioned was, let's put them in the houses. So the control for the solar home system, they're not complex, right? So you just have it, and then you have a limit. You spend more than that, that's it, right? You run out of power, and that's it. Then as we integrate different, let's say nanogrids, 5 houses, 10 houses, then okay, how are we gonna manage that energy transactions? But then if we want to integrate like 100 houses, 2,000 houses, then there's another level of complexity in the controls. Now we have a different set of microgrids, how we integrate multiple microgrids, and there's also a line of study for that, right? So what kind of controls are needed to integrate those microgrids, and then mini grids, and then grids. But the first thing is, where do you want to put the generation, the storage that you're going to control, and then once you control for this, then how you integrate. So it's an important question, but first that needs to be established. What is the priority and for what reason? To benefit who, and how much is the cost, who's going to pay, who's going to take the risk for that, and then go to the control. So in the microgrid laboratory, that's a very important technical question and research. But for example, I'm taking a step back and say, okay, let's put the thing in the houses first, and in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll figure out how to best interact with new power converters and smart meters and all that.
Okay.
So the last thing I want to add is the theme of RISE, is sort of what can universities do. So universities have the right mix of sort of expertise and then sovereignty. as well as appetite for risk that allows them to try to make these microgrids on the location, and they can be first leaders, they can stub their toes, they can make mistakes, and then feed that up to other people. And so UC San Diego, Santa Rosa JC has a microgrid that I'm on the advisory board for. So we're trying to share those things across different places. And California is funding those efforts.
Just a quickie. I'm gonna play Thomas game on today's panel. So if we take it where you left it, then we need to in our quest for visualizing how we govern uncertainty, which is another panel, but now dealing with developing a language for it. There is an issue with finance and uncertainty. I mean, it's right in the middle of it. And as we do it right now, NSF is not giving you money for uncertain stuff. NSF funds what they know they know. And you actually got to organize around knowledge to actually go ask for money to incrementally do these things, and climate change doesn't work that way. So we have a misalignment there. Financially, my question to you is, how could RISE help you guys? Because I know each one of you have individual work agendas around this issue, but how could we find a way to finance really important work under high levels of uncertainty, not having to wait for a Center for Excellence or an ERC, for all of us to have to fly all over the place to different places to then say what we know, because time is of the essence. And how do you have any ideas about how RISE could help you interconnect nationwide to be able to serve an accelerator for financing of this type of innovation?
Well, I have a question for that I was thinking about. We have to move deliberately, but we also have to move with a certain risk appetite. And is there a field that researchers what's the optimum rate of pilots and failure if you want to move things closely? Could you have a portfolio and you could look at that and say, you're not failing often enough to actually be moving forward quickly? I don't know if that's something that we can add into kind of our ideas, but I don't know, that might be true. I'm completely unsupported by evidence.
I'm thinking of things that I need is leaving the RISE conference. And I think the main thing that I'll need is time. Because I already talked to different people that I'm excited about potential collaboration. And then thinking, okay, how am I going to actually spend time working on this effectively without affecting my own well-being? So that's maybe in terms of resources, time is number one. The other one, financial. I mean, I have realized that it does help to have a funded effort. It's good to talk and then you collaborate and maybe do papers together, but when you have a funded effort, it does make a difference in terms of what you can accomplish. So that's another part. Those are the two main things. How to spark that quiet time. I don't know. These are the biggest challenges that I see.
I totally agree with Marcel. We need time. In the University of Puerto Rico, for example, we are teaching, the equivalent of 18 credit hours a semester. With that workload, it's very difficult to keep the relationships that we are developing in this kind of conferences. On the other hand, I believe, and that was my last not shown slide, I believe that this platform will help us connect definitely with other colleagues and develop new things, new ideas. Keeping the RISE context into perspective. It's totally new. We are trying to prepare for the unknown. So, and the unknown happens every day. So it definitely helps to have your institution as part of the RISE platform, fully supporting you into this collaboration.
And then from the design standpoint, I would say it's a little less tangible, I think, but avoiding stepping on the toes of other universities working in the same locations and being able to know if a community has already been working with the university and having knowledge transfer happen much more quickly and much more coordinatedly. And that just goes back to trust and making sure that communities don't start to suffer planning fatigue and tune out and say, we don't want any more interaction. We want to be having something tangible produced, and maybe that's a long-term study with a short-term as-built or something like that.
So we just have 9 minutes left. I saw a lot of hands, so maybe quick questions and quick answers. You can go in the back. Yeah.
As you think about the microgrid proposal, and there's a radical way of doing it, every piece of equipment requires some sort of CapEx and some sort of clawback of capital to reinvest in as the equipment deteriorates over time. How do you build that in so that the most vulnerable communities that benefit from the microgrid technology are not left vulnerable as that technology or failure occurs down the road? Because the initial big bang to install it, everyone's kind of pumped up about it, right? The secondary mechanism 7 or 10 years down the road, who picks that maintenance piece up? Because right now the power grid goes down, the operations central committee or company sends out the team to do it. On a microgrid level, nanogrid level especially, how do you ensure those most vulnerable have the means put aside somewhere? Who steps in and fills that need for them?
You also quickly introduce yourself.
What's that? Oh, my name's Wayne Lynch. I'm actually from Niagara County Community College and the Niagara Falls Power Authority.
So, I'll try to answer quickly. I think we have to look at the level of decentralization that we want. So I would say that microgrid level is still too centralized to start with. So we need to look at the lower level and then compare these things of operation and management with the basic individual household units. Because then when you are a microgrid and how you manage and operate, there is an added cost when you look even at community level than a household level. So you need to put all that in place when you compare alternatives, and I think that's not been done. So it's very good to include those things when you compare microgrid, mini grid, also a household level. What's the cost of operating and in terms of replacing, then you start with the household. You need to replace the batteries, the inverters, and depending on what you buy, and have that as a base case, and then compare with other more network options.
My hypothesis is it's an unsolved problem, and we don't actually completely value transmission and distribution as much as we need to, or we don't pay for it. So that might be something we have to figure out.
Yeah.
I have a policy question, and it seems like in these kinds of sessions, we quickly go to the technical, how do we rebuild and how do we work around the system to get to the solution. So I wanted to ask, especially Lionel and Marcel, there are many claims over the past year of consultation, building the new laws that have been put in place, and especially the one related to community solar. Many claims made. Also, there is the new regulatory body, which was, I believe, compromised by Versailles. So I want to ask you, what are the policy concerns you most would like to see addressed, so that there might be a policy component for all of the work that's going on in the countryside to build these grids? What do you need? What do you want to see happen policy-wise to enable all of this?
You also introduce yourself.
I'll say
Sandy, can you quickly introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm an anthropologist in University of North Carolina that studies oil and gas, and I'm the producer of Distant Power, the film last night.
So I'll say my quick word is top two. First is investment in natural gas infrastructure, which still can fit into the actual energy policy. That's my biggest worry. The second one will be the mini grids. How much money is going to be invested in mini grids if it continues, as compared to other options that, in my opinion, will be much more effective, and they're not being considered. So those two things can fit well within the actual energy policy, and I worry that they can go through unchallenged, or unchallenged, not enough.
In terms of policy, I believe that the first problem in Puerto Rico is that we talk about microgrids as if that is a magical thing. You put that and it works, and that's all. And actually, we are in Puerto Rico, some community solar projects have been named microgrids when they are not. So, for example, Toro Negro. Toro Negro is a nice solution for a place where after the hurricanes spend a lot of time down, and it's a solution for the community, but it doesn't work as a microgrid per se. So that changes the idea of a microgrid. And in terms of policy, it has to be established as, it is already established in the Act 19, but Act 19 is a law made by some lawmakers that not necessarily have the support of technical people that shows them what the difference is between a community solar power versus microgrid versus other stuff. So it's in the law, but once we get to the regulations, we'll see problems and crashes in that framework. So what we need is that the regulators put their effort in creating a good regulation so that these kind of solutions get, I believe.
Thank you.
Yeah, and could you quickly introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Spanish.
Oh, sorry, behind you.
Hi, my name's Alba. I'm from the University of Albany. And I know a lot about Cuba and their recovery efforts. They seem to be very applauded around the world. And I was just wondering, why did it take so long for the electricity to come back up in Puerto Rico, when you see a country like Cuba that has to suffer from economic blockades and sabotage and all this stuff? They seem to get right with it as soon as something happens and get the job done. And there's always a lot of hope and inspiration when you see them, when you see the newspapers and people going up there on the ladder fixing the this and that. But what took so long to put the electricity back on?
Almost a year ago, I was at a conference in Cuba, and we were talking about these things. So there are two things. One is that when I try to look at it objectively from my perspective, Cuba is much better prepared to recover after a hurricane. That's my perspective. However, the hurricanes that they have had, like 2017, and they had a big blackout of 2 weeks, right? But when I look at the intensity of that hurricane, it was not like Maria, and it didn't cross Cuba the way it crossed Puerto Rico. So right now, I don't think we have a case that we can compare, but it is my impression that they are much better prepared from the system. So your point is very important, how we can learn something from what they have done with much less resources to get prepared. So we shouldn't have an excuse because we are a poor colony, that's a fact. However, Cuba is also a poor country when you look at the national income and things like that. So we need to collaborate more, and I'm thinking, how can we look at publicly available data so we can collaborate in spite of the political blockade and economic blockade. So it's a work that we need to do, how to learn more from that.
Great. So we are at time now, so I'd like to offer 30 seconds to each of the panelists for any last thoughts on the topic of today. We start with Lena.
Well, I think that looking forward, we should be trying to create a network of networks, meaning that with lots of microgrid possibly, if they solve communities' problems. If they are not, if those solutions are not there to solve people's problem, we have to look to other solutions.
The main thing should be, how can we provide access to electricity to the population after a disaster? What is the most effective way of doing it, and also the most cost-effective way of doing it? It has to be a minimum so it can help people survive these events, but also a minimum to sustain a quality of life. And now, we need to have things on the table and let the decision be followed by science, and that's not happening now. There are always going to be interest, but we need to do that. And perhaps that's the biggest challenge. How can we push with science and different studies that could be different in conclusion, but how can we be led by that?
So I'm interested in the role of the university, a complementary role to the traditional sort of research role. So you research, you come up with solutions, you maybe try to commercialize them. Another role is the university as a citizen, participant, stakeholder, and survivor of these disasters. What can we do in practice as a complete university community that sort of demonstrates new ways to go forward?
And I would just say infrastructure is not just technical but spatial. Energy is always political. All of them have some connection integration with the built environment. And so while there's different disciplinary subsets and the kind of larger design fields don't have as much to say about the kind of technical expertise of the electrical system, I think we always need to be thinking holistically about space and the kind of social dimensions of social infrastructure and physical infrastructure.
Great. Well, I'll just end with